I'm Rob House, and I teach international law and legal philosophy here at the law school. It's a pleasure today to introduce and moderate this amazing panel on Brexit. So, what is Brexit? Brexit is a hashtag to denote everything connected to or that might flow from a referendum vote in the United Kingdom towards the end of June to leave the European Union. And today, our speakers who will address a wide range of issues and challenges that stem from that vote, which I think is often confused with a decision to leave the EU. It's just an expression of opinion that might have various kinds of consequences, many of the broader issues and implications. So the panelists are Gronya de Burca, Mervyn King, Gillian Tett, and Joseph Weiler, and I'm going to say a little bit about each and why I wanted them to participate. It'll become evident why I wanted them to participate. Gronya de Burca is the Jean Monnet professor, sorry, that's not true, director of the Jean Monnet Center here and professor of EU law and co-author of the leading text of EU law. Lord Mervyn King is a professor of law and economics, both in the law school and in the Stern School, and the recent author of a wonderful book, The End of Alchemy, which contains much unconventional wisdom about the role of central banking and indeed the banking system in general in macroeconomic policy making. And for those of you who typically only resort to books about things like economics and finance when your usual sleeping medication fails, the book is written in a wonderful provocateur, almost enfant terrible style, which is absolutely a delight to read, and I expect similarly unconventional wisdom here today about Brexit. Gillian Tett is the U.S. managing editor of the Financial Times and has written many insightful and also out-of-the-box type articles about Brexit. She's also the author of a book, The Silo Effect, which is on the costs of narrow experts not really talking to each other across disciplines or different roles in organizations. And in a way, I think that's partly my manifesto, because I've always tried to break down those barriers. And our final panelist, Joseph Weiler, will remember an exercise that he and I were involved in where trade lawyers were forced to write articles with trade economists. And it took a while to break down the silos, and in not all cases they were broken down. But if you ever expand your book, it would be an interesting case study of the results.
Absolutely.
Joseph Weiler is university professor at NYU and former president of the European University Institute, who has written some of the most famous and also most deeply insightful works on the meaning of the project of European integration, a number of which are collected in a book called The Constitution of Europe, and again, written in a humanistic style that I think those of you who expect these discussions of European integration to be very arcane and all about citing different provisions of the treaties, which have all changed over years, as you know, will find this collection most rewarding. And indeed, and I'll come to this when I pose a few questions later on, one might say that Joseph's warnings about repackaging the EU project as the building of a kind of superstate or even a unitary or primary constitutional order, perhaps if those warnings had been listened to more or followed, we might not be quite in the situation we're in today. So thanks to all the panelists for being with us. I look forward to a great session, and over to you, Gronya.
Thanks, Rob. So what I'm going to do is just to open this panel by giving you a brief update on the current state of play with regard to Brexit. So you'll have seen there's a whole set of questions that were posed in the publicity for this event. I'm not even going to try to answer those, but I hope that'll be part of our exchange afterwards. But what I thought I would do is just to assume that everyone in the room knows one or two basic facts, but beyond that, that many people, there's a lot less known, and to try and say a little bit about where things are and say what we do know and what we don't know about Brexit. So most people know that on the 23rd of June, earlier this year, a majority of the British people voted in a referendum for Britain to leave the European Union. To stop being a member of the European Union. And that was carried by a majority of 52 to 48%. It broke down roughly, younger people voted more to remain, older people, I won't go into definitions of age of what's young and old, I leave that to you, but the statistics show that older people voted by a majority to leave. And insofar as it's possible to distill reasons from such a complex exercise, I think two main kinds of reasons seem to explain the vote. One is simplified, a kind of a desire to regain sovereignty, to regain greater political, legal, and economic control as a state. And the second, more specific policy issue related to migration, and in particular, the free movement of workers within and across the European Union from state to state, and concerns about inward migration into the UK in particular. So that's one fact, or the one fact that's well known is the outcome of the vote. The second fact is probably that most of you are aware of, is that it's been an issue of huge significance. It's been treated as a kind of an earthquake, a major geopolitical event. It's been compared to all kinds of things like the fall of the Berlin Wall and so on. My companion here is skeptical of this kind of perspective, but I think the fact that the room is full suggests that people are, for some reason, even outside the UK, very interested in what this event means, what the vote of the Britain to leave the UK is about, what its implications are, and so on. So I take that to be some kind of reflection that the earthquake view of the Brexit vote has some traction even outside of Europe. Okay, so just to put a little bit into historical context, Britain has been a member of the European Union for 43 years, since it joined in 1973. It had made an earlier bid for membership in the early 1960s, and that was vetoed by France under President de Gaulle. Interestingly, because France doubted Britain's commitment to the project of European integration, or at least that was the expression at the time. Then Britain became a member, joined in 1973, and 2 years after that, after a change of government in the UK, held a referendum on membership, on whether to continue after this initial foray with EU membership. And that time, the vote carried by a two-thirds majority in favour of remaining. So just to fast forward to where we are today. So apart from that, those facts, the negative referendum and the fact that it's a major event and that its ramifications are still unfolding, the one thing I think that I've said this elsewhere before that characterizes, I think, the situation since the vote is deep uncertainty, really profound uncertainty. I think that was evident in the days, months, and weeks after the vote, but I think it's still evident now. And so one of the things I'm going to try to do now and say, well, is there anything that we do know for certain? Is there anything that we can say clearly about the situation as it stands at present? So I'm going to try and address three questions, two properly. The third, I'll just open it and then pass on to the other panelists and allow for a fuller discussion. So the first is just a basic question, which I think some of you will be wondering about, is, well, is Brexit actually going to happen? Or is there any remaining doubt about whether that'll happen? The second thing is, if it is going to happen, do we know when it will happen? So those are I'm trying to cabin the most manageable questions to start. And then the third one, the more open and complex question is, do we know the terms on which it's likely to happen? So the first, is Brexit going to happen? Well, for those of you who were following the debate in the media, one of the familiar framings that I read and I found very amusing, but also it had some traction, was the idea that the reaction to the vote was a little bit like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. You know, the 5 stages of grief begin with denial. I'm going to forget the order now, but it certainly starts with denial and ends with acceptance. And in the middle are anger, bargaining, and depression. So denial certainly hit hard, I think, after the vote. I think that really was, and I think some of that is actually related, not so much to not having thought about it, but how difficult it is to actually get your head around all the ramifications, because Britain's been a member of this entity for 43 years, and it's an immensely complex process and project, and that's part of the problem with the EU. It's very, very complicated, and so membership is a web of interconnections, and just imagining what it would be like to undo that and what the implications would be was part of, I think, the denial reaction. But in any case, are we still in a state of denial? Less so now, I think, and part of that is due to the current political leadership in Britain, where the Prime Minister has been very adamant, and that's the phrase you see reflected here, that, you know, Brexit means Brexit, and that phrase, which I'll come back to, is taken to mean it's going to happen, we're going to leave, stop looking for a way out. So the initial protests, calls for a second referendum, you know, impassioned pleas to reconsider and so on, have died off a little. We have a current political leadership in the UK that seems very committed to carrying it through and to eliminating at least that uncertainty. Many, many other uncertainties remain, but at least that uncertainty, it will happen. Another slight element of, so apart from the popular response and maybe the Remainers protests, were also that parts of the UK, in particular Scotland and Northern Ireland, in a relatively devolved United Kingdom, voted by a majority to remain. And those parts of Britain are, and even more so now in Northern Ireland, there's great anxiety about the idea of the return of a border between the south and the north of Ireland, for example. The consequences for places like Scotland, which voted very strongly to remain in the UK, are still, there may be some elements of, if not denial, still strong opposition being felt there and continuing. So with that as a kind of the basic position, I think, is that there's a much more of a sense that politically there's a commitment to Brexit happening. There are one or two caveats, maybe. One is that there are several legal challenges pending at the moment. So I think it's 7 in all, but some of them have been amalgamated. Yeah, but they're being heard in the UK High Court this month. And the nature, or I think the main legal ground for the challenge is hinging around Article 50 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the Treaty of European Union. Article 50, just to say, is the procedure, the provision which provides for the mechanism by which a state leaves the UK. And it says that a state shall make a decision to leave according to its own constitutional requirements. That's the first step. Then it communicates that to the European Council, which is all the heads of state and government, and then a procedure of negotiation begins, which is 2 years in length, at the end of which the state shall leave. So that procedure of triggering Article 50, of sending the notice to the European Union, the Council, the heads of state, to tell them Britain is leaving, the challenge is being brought domestically to the procedure for doing that, for triggering the 2-year period. And the challenge is based on the idea that this is not an act for the executive alone. It's not up to the government to do this. It has to be put to Parliament. And so that's the nature of the challenge. And the idea is, for those who are bringing the challenge, they feel if it goes to Parliament, it's much more likely to encounter difficulty because it's assumed that a majority of the Parliament is against exiting the EU, and so that the process for triggering the procedure for leaving will be hindered or held up or prevented if it goes to a parliamentary vote. So that litigation is ongoing at the moment. I'd find it hard. I'm reluctant to predict anything anymore after Brexit and many other things happening around the world, including in this country at the moment. But at the same time, I would say that, you know, it would be a very controversial thing for a court to do, I think, to step in and to determine that the procedure that's been chosen by the government to trigger Article 50 wrong, because the British have, as most of you probably know, an unwritten constitution, so deciding exactly what is constitutionally required for this procedure, to have that determined by a court, given the political stakes, would seem to me a risky thing, and I would be surprised, but I could be wrong on that one. So that's the caveat. The other tiny caveat just to show you, by the way, I said the one thing I can answer clearly, will it happen and so on. You can see how unclear even that question is. I think on the preponderance of evidence, I would say it seems at present that Brexit will go ahead. There's a political commitment to that, but there are these judicial challenges. And the second thing is there's some slight possibility, under certain circumstances, if there were to be a general election and parties campaigned on the basis of holding a second referendum, it is imaginable that a party that won and that had committed to holding a second referendum could do so. One tiny possibility for that to happen would be that the present Prime Minister, Theresa May, announced this week that she would put a bill to Parliament to repeal the Act of 1972 that made EU law binding in the UK. So even before exiting, the idea is to have a domestic bill repealing the legislation that made EU law binding in the UK. So that's another, imagine if Parliament refused to pass that, could that trigger the kind of crisis that would call for an election and so on. So there are some uncertainties still in the process. Putting those aside, however, let's assume that if things go according to plan as the Prime Minister sees them, that Brexit will happen. When will it happen? So on to question 2. Well, that's a little bit easier to answer, because Theresa May announced this week that the trigger for the Article 50 trigger would take place at the end of March next year. So that is a date at which the government plans to notify the Council that Britain wishes to exit, and the 2-year period will start to run. The 2-year period is one which, under the terms of Article 50, result in an automatic withdrawal of the state at the end of the 2-year period, regardless of whether they've negotiated a satisfactory deal or not. But there is a provision for it to be extended by mutual consent. So that's another uncertainty in the timing. Most people say, why would the EU allow for a further period, in a sense? But we still don't know what might happen during the negotiations, and whether, if no satisfactory deal is reached for either side or one side, there might be an extension. However, assuming none of those eventualities come to pass, assuming Article 50 is triggered at the end of March, it will be 2 years so it'll be March 2019 that Britain should, on this timetable, exit the EU. Okay, so the last question, and I won't say much about this because this is the meat of the panel, I assume, which is, do we know the terms on which it's likely to happen? And that goes back to the title of Brexit Means Brexit. And I can't resist reading from an article, I think it was yesterday, in the Financial Times, not by Gillian Tett, but Robert Shrimsley, and it's very funny. Partly, I love articles on Brexit that make me laugh, because I find the whole thing very depressing, but sometimes these are humorous. This is a very humorous one, and it's framed in that 5 stages of grief analysis that other journalists have used, and he's talking about having been moved rapidly from denial to acceptance without any of the in-between stages, but then we have to have 2 years of the bargaining, and what happens if we're depressed at the end of the bargaining? Can we go back to denial again? Not like the package itself. So he says, well, the Prime Minister tells us in Thatcherite tones that Brexit means Brexit, and that would be very helpful if we knew what the second Brexit means. So Brexit means Brexit, but could it mean soft Brexit or hard Brexit, or somewhere in the middle Brexit? And it might also mean Sexit or Harksit or Mexit, or maybe even what the Hexit. And so that's where he ends. And a lot of people feel a little bit like that about what does it mean? And that's where all the tough questions begin. So I won't say much about hard and soft Brexit. I think Joseph is going to address that in part. But just to say that there are these 2 poles or positions where hard exit means leaving entirely and starting afresh, starting to renegotiate the terms of a relationship of a sovereign state, Britain, with this entity, the EU, from scratch, to some version of that. Whereas soft Brexit is taken to mean some version of remaining connected, and particularly with what's called the single market. And the single market is the part of the European Union that deals with the sort of core of economic integration. There are 4 freedoms: free movement of persons, of capital, of services, and I always forget the 4th one. Goods. Exactly. So being part of, and there are countries. The point is, there are countries which are members of the EU single market without being members of the EU, and then there's a whole array in between of countries that have arrangements that are sort of partially integrated into the single market. The obvious three, the EFTA states, as they're called, Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland, are parties to the EU single market without being full political members, without participating in decision making and so on. And that was an option perhaps for the UK. It seems to be after this week that, after the Prime Minister's speech, that seems less likely, but nobody really knows, because nobody really knows what the bargaining strategy of the UK or of the EU is likely to be. So we're in a position of uncertainty. Just one last thing.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was going to break in here. So Grania has talked a lot about uncertainty, and Mervyn King, I think part of your economic philosophy is that nothing should be as predictable as uncertainty. So is this the kind of uncertainty that market actors, that government actors in these advanced economies and political systems are going to be unable to somehow handle without catastrophe, or is it more of just a world of uncertainty?
No, and I think I would certainly put my cards on the table and say that where I disagree with Grania is not in her description of the substance of this, but in the view that somehow it's all terribly uncertain and therefore it's a earthquake for the world. One thing that's very striking is that during the campaign, those who wanted to stay in the EU were absolutely certain they knew of the consequences. We would all be exactly £4,310 worse off. Now, having voted to leave, instead of saying they know exactly what the consequences are, they're saying it's now a world full of massive uncertainty. It's very hard to reconcile these two positions. I've been struck by the following. When I went round the finance ministers of Europe, and I met many of them in the referendum campaign, most of them said to me that they were not particularly concerned about the economic impact of Brexit on their own economy. What they were really worried about was the political demonstration effect of British voting to leave the EU on the popularity of their own Eurosceptic parties in their own countries. Now, what I think is quite revealing is actually there's been no sign of that whatsoever. And whether or not people in Spain or Italy or other countries wish to be Eurosceptic or traditional members of the EU is a function of their own judgment about what it means for their own country. They don't slavishly follow what the British do. So I think this doesn't have enormous significance for the rest of the world. And it may have importance and significance for the UK. I don't think we know what the long-run economic effects will be, though my guess is there'll be a whole lot less than either side pretended in the campaign. After all, if I were to show you a diagram of the level of gross domestic product of the United Kingdom in the post-war period and ask you to identify, without Grania giving you the answer, what was the year that Britain joined the EU, for good or bad, you would not be able to identify it. And I think the same is going to be true in 40 years' time when we look back at the impact of the UK leaving the EU. So I think it's very important not to exaggerate the implications of all this. Of course, there's going to be a process of negotiating with the rest of the EU, but the philosophy behind this, which has been set out, is one which I think is in one sense very simple. And the awkwardness which the UK has is that quite remarkably, and this was really quite extraordinary, neither side in the referendum campaign had made any plans whatsoever as to what to do in the event that the vote was Brexit. So what we're now in a position is, now we know the result, now the people tasked with implementing it, politicians and officials, are having to think from scratch as to how they're going to make it work. And that's why it may look a little bit full of uncertainty, but it will evolve. And in one sense, the broad picture is relatively clear. First, and it was always obvious that this was the right thing to do, repeal the European Communities Act, and then at the same time pass a one-paragraph piece of legislation that would simply grandfather all the existing acts of Parliament pursuant to that 1972 Act, which would leave the UK in the position of A, no longer being subject to EU law or the European Court of Justice, in other words, an actual sovereign country again, and secondly, that the UK Parliament could take its time to decide which, if any, acts that it had to adopt because of membership of the EU, it wished to repeal, or which ones to keep. And many it will choose to keep, I think, trading standards and things of that sort. Others will be highly politically contentious, such as the rights of employees, hours of work and so on, and that'll be a question for the UK Parliament to settle. When it comes to trade, I think the first step is to have informal negotiations with countries outside the EU. For those countries with which the EU does already have a trade agreement, the obvious position is to say to those countries, why don't, on the date when we leave the EU, we just roll over the existing trade agreement we have as a virtue of the UK's membership of the EU? That will be the status quo. If either side wants to suggest an improvement, that can be done. With countries with which the EU does not have a trade agreement, such as China, then we can go to China and say, well, why don't we discuss a trade agreement? Either we'll get one, in which case we're better off, or we won't, in which case we got the status quo. And I think people are putting too much weight on the final step in all this, which will be the discussion on the final agreement on discussion on trade with the other countries in the EU. And there are two things to be said about this, and then I'll stop. One is that, as Grania correctly said, a very clear result of this referendum was that as a result of dithering and actually actively lying to the British population, British governments over the years pretended that they were going to control immigration and did not because they could not. And the result of this referendum is a clear statement that the British government has fairly quickly now to come up with a statement of what it thinks British immigration policy should be and to implement it. And that is non-negotiable, and that will be on the table. Now, I think, put that way, then we will then move on after a period to discuss trade. Ironically, the only time in which it's a big advantage to have a large trade deficit is when you're negotiating trade agreements with the countries with which you have a large trade deficit. We have a big trade deficit. Almost all of it is actually with the other countries in the EU. So we're in quite a strong position to suggest, at least as far as trading goods is concerned, that we negotiate an agreement, as the EU has done with other countries, to have basically free trade in goods. If they don't want to do that, then frankly they will lose more in terms of lost exports to the UK than we will lose in terms of lost exports to the EU. And when it comes to financial services, which people talk a lot about, and it's important, but it's not that important. It doesn't dominate British national interests. And there are ways around it. And frankly, having spoken to many people in the financial services industry, I would expect them to negotiate quite hard with the many competing alternative financial centres in the EU. There is no one alternative financial centre. And indeed, they'll negotiate with the British government to get concessions in order to find tax reliefs and other benefits which they'll try to negotiate. But the end result will be that they will not move large numbers of net jobs out of London into the rest of the EU. The UK's position as a world financial centre in the European time zone is not really, in my judgment, under challenge. Now, there are many details to be sorted out. That's why we hire civil servants. But you don't say that they dominate the broad strategy that you adopt towards it. And I think that it's pretty clear that we will leave. I don't see any politician voting against that. No one has really come up seriously and suggested that we go back on it. And one final point, if you actually look at the political scientists have tried to map the votes in the referendum, which were not in parliamentary constituencies, but in larger voting areas. They tried to map them back into what it meant for what the vote must have been in individual constituencies. And their best judgment, and it can only be a judgment, is that something like 2/3 of the constituencies in the UK Parliament voted to leave. And of the 12 nations and regions of the United Kingdom, out of those 12, 9 voted to leave, and only 3, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and London, voted to remain. So I do not think there is going to be a great deal of political impetus to try to overturn this, but there will be plenty of scope for debate and discussion about the terms and what ultimately we will negotiate. But the first steps in this, the legal steps to repeal the European Communities Act, to grandfather legislation, to start discussions on trade deals with countries outside the EU. I know we can't legally, formally negotiate, but that doesn't stop people having coffee together. And many of these things can be done, and this process will gradually take place. It is most unfortunate that neither side in the referendum spent any time thinking about these issues beforehand, and I think that's part of the mess that we're in. But that's what happens with politicians.
So the day or so after Brexit, we happened to be, after the Brexit vote, excuse me, what a slip. We happened to be at dinner at friends in London, and their alarm at the result, I think it's fair to say, didn't have so much to do with what's been discussed so far, the political and economic uncertainty, but the worry that the vote demonstrated the ability to politically mobilize a constituency that's atavistic, xenophobic, anti-foreigner, protectionist, and that the real danger is not in whether economic and political uncertainty generally can be managed, but on the unleashing of these forces in mainstream or mainstreaming them in politics. And I know many people have made analogies to the rise of Donald Trump in the US. And so, Gillian Tett, I know that you wrote and I found very interesting piece in August about the lessons that Americans should or should not draw from the Brexit vote. Is it in part about the effective mobilization of these constituencies, or in some sense, is it kind of their last stand, as younger people don't seem to be buying into this so much?
Wow, that's a big question. Well, it's great to be here. It's also always rather scary to follow in after Mervyn King, who was a man I wrote about many times a few years ago and often chided me for getting it wrong. So you can chide me again now if you'd like.
I'm ready.
A few points. First of all, I should congratulate you on holding this debate today, because in fact, those of you who follow UK politics will know that the UK Conservative Party is actually having its annual conference right now in Birmingham. And we've had really the first really important statement speech from Theresa May and the rest of her cabinet in the last 72 hours. And what has become clear in that speech is that firstly, we are probably heading towards a fairly hard-ish Brexit. And secondly, many of the political themes that emerged around the Brexit vote are ones that she is capitalizing on, building on, and essentially playing to in the rhetoric in a way that rips up many of the traditional party political rules and has echoes of many of the themes that are emerging right now in the US election. So if you're not already a subscriber to the FT, do go and look at the website and our analysis, because it's really quite striking what's happening there right now, today, as we're meeting here. I wrote a column, as Robert just said, a few weeks after the Brexit vote, trying to look at some of the parallels between Brexit and Donald Trump. And I'm just going to point out 3 or 4 of those parallels and then add a 5th one that became clear, as I say, today. The first one, the very obvious one, is that yes, electorates are angry and frustrated. Very obvious, we all know about that. And I would argue that anger could be summed up with one word, which is stuckness. Sounds a bit strange, stuckness. But when I look at what the themes that are emerging around Donald Trump's campaign, I've spent quite a lot of time looking at that and actually going to the RNC and things, there's this element of being very stuck and just desperate to shake things up, to change the way that things are going, to, if you like, scream against the status quo. And to a certain degree, I think that fed into the Brexit result. There was a very interesting split, as many of you know, between the geographical patterns of who voted for and against Brexit. There was also a split between educational levels. For the most part, the more educated you were in the UK, the more you voted against Brexit. There was also some income split, and there was a very big age split, one of the most interesting things of all, that it tended to be the older people who were pro-Brexit and the youngest who wanted to remain. My own family epitomizes this, and actually most of my friends of my age who have had international lives of some sort or other and who might be termed the elite, we all find ourselves in a very similar situation where our parents voted for Brexit and we didn't. And it's caused an awful lot of family stress amongst different families I know. So that's the first point to make. Lots of anger, lots of frustration, lots of squeals of pain against status quo and stuckness. The second point is that I think there's quite an interesting phenomenon going on in the Western world, which is that electorates are losing their fear of leaping into the unknown, because they've already been told over the last decade that they had to believe in 6 impossible things before breakfast, to paraphrase Alice in Wonderland, in the financial world. I mean, the financial collapse of 2008 and 2007 ripped up many of the certainties and the rules. They've been told to believe that in the realm of economics, where suddenly people are talking about QE and zero rates or negative rates that overturns what people used to think was normal. So the idea of ripping up some of the rules in politics is no longer quite as scary. Boundaries suddenly seem a lot more fluid. Which brings me on to my third point, which is that in today's world, when you're dealing with this angry, frustrated voter who no longer have quite such the same level of fear of leaping into the unknown, it's very clear from the Brexit campaign and the current one that, frankly, you can't talk to them just through statistics, or even through statistics. People are in no mood for nice, rational arguments of the sort that tend to pepper the pages of the FT. Things like slogans really, really matter, and connecting with the voters in an emotional sense and recognizing their anger. And I'm very struck by the fact that when you talk to Brexit campaigners, some of them say that they think the tide began to turn in their favor when they adopted the slogan, "Take back control." Nice, short, snappy, pithy. It has a verb. It gives a sense of empowerment. It has an inbuilt sense of the future and of motion. The Remain camp, it should be said, didn't really have a clear slogan. It was all a mishmash of statistics and very confusing. That is incredibly similar to what's happening right now with the Republican and Democrat side. If I was to ask you all what's the slogan for the Republican Party, you'd probably all chant out together, "Make America Great Again." You might hate it, but you know it. If I ask you what the slogan is for the Democrats, those of you who follow it closely might say "Stronger Together," but there's a second slogan, "I'm with her," which sounds like something out of a boy band. And I went to the DNC, and it was a totally confusing mishmash of different images and ideas and, dare I say it, statistics. And those two slogans don't have verbs and motion. They're not future-orientated. They're not particularly dynamic. They don't reek of empowerment. And that worries me. 2 other quick points. Social media matters enormously. I think today's social media revolution or technology revolution means that the vertical axes of trust are crumbling in favor of horizontal axes of trust. I haven't got time to go into it, but what that means is that people increasingly look to their Facebook friends for information rather than experts. There's a fascinating survey from Edelman which shows that pretty clearly in terms of how trust patterns have changed. And that has 2 implications. Firstly, because social media is very fragmented, and it's an illusion to think that it brings us together automatically. It can create cyber tribes as much as anything else, and intellectual ghettos. What's happening is you can have entirely competing versions of the truth, essentially living in parallel universes, and different political sides talking past each other, and barely being even aware of what's making the other side tick. Social media and technology is a very seductive thing in terms of actually creating as much fragmentation as connectivity. And the last point is, and this really plays into what's happened today in England, both Brexit and I'd argue the current vote shows that the old boundaries of left and right and the pre-packaged ideas of party platforms are crumbling quite rapidly. Theresa May has said things like she wants to support the National Health Service in the UK today. She's said a lot of quite populist, crowd-pleasing, Middle England things that, frankly, most Americans, when they think about a right-wing party and free market economics, would be absolutely shocked by. And yet she's also campaigning on a pretty free market platform in other areas. The idea of having clear-cut right and left is definitely crumbling, and that's true of American politics too. All kinds of reasons for that, won't go into it, but briefly, I think we live in Generation C, generation customization, where kids are trained to expect from a young age that it is their God-given right to customize everything, be that their coffee choices, be that their T-shirts, their music playlists, be that their news sources, be that their politics. and the idea of accepting a la carte anything has gone out the window. Which brings me back to my last point, which is at the end of the day, I think that one of the biggest reasons that the Brexit vote won was it presented a very simple unipolar message and symbol around which everyone could essentially rally if they were angry. In a pick and mix world, it was one thing that everybody could clearly understand. Take back control had enormous power. And before anyone becomes too confident about the fortunes of the Democrats and Clinton, I think that's a message that everyone needs to heed.
So, Joseph, I'd like to get your view. There's a standard, I think, view that the European Union has always evolved through crisis. Do you think this is just going to be another example of that, where in response to Brexit, there is a positive taking stock and more of a willingness to face some of the contradictions and unmet challenges of the EU today, including, as I think you rightly said, the democratic deficit, the uneasy relationship of the European project to the idea of democracy?
The rhetoric is that, because if we look at the reaction beyond the first initial infantile anger, but now we're in a more mature stage, there basically we hear two messages. One is we need more integration, so use Brexit as a relaunch of the project. And the other is we're going to play hardball with the UK. They're not going to get off lightly. And I think both are misconceived and a recipe for a very unfortunate unfolding of the Brexit follow-up. The we need more integration is fanciful because you have at least 7 member states with governments who are openly Eurosceptic. And to have more integration, which would require an amendment of the treaties, you need unanimity, and there's simply not going to be unanimity among the remaining 27 for any ambitious plan. And if there's a second round, I can say what that might be. The position towards Britain is motivated, as we heard, beyond the anger we show them. Two things are happening. First of all, it's a camouflage. It's, if you want, anger and denial for not thinking deeply. Look, I should raise my colors. I have 5 kids who are British. They're young. They would have all voted to stay in. And on balance, I think it was a bad decision for the United Kingdom to leave the European Union. Potentially the greatest damage to the United Kingdom would be the breakup of the United Kingdom, because there's a bigger chance that Scotland and Scottish nationalists would use this as leverage, and that would be really tragic. It's very bad for the European Union, both in its international posture, because Britain has a specific gravity which is much greater than if you just count the population or the GDP, etc. Britain is a world presence of a very particular kind, and also because Britain was a very important voice within the EU, which will be lost. So I think, on balance, it's regrettable that it happened. But having said that, 2 points. It's not unfounded anger. Let's take control. What was it?
Take back control.
Take back control. There is something very deep which justified that sentiment, because I'm going to give you now 60 seconds on the democracy deficit of the European Union. The most primitive notions of democracy are 2. One is, if we don't like who governs us, we can throw the scoundrels out. It's not a definition of democracy, but if you can't throw the scoundrels out, if you can't change who governs you, it's difficult to speak about democracy. And the European Union exercises huge and significant governance power, and yet there's no moment in the civic life of the European Union, certainly not elections to the European Parliament, where you can throw the scoundrels out and change the people who govern you. And the second very basic primitive notion of any democracy that we know is that voter preference has to be translated somehow into policy. So if you have a majority or plurality which is center-left, you expect to see center-left policies. And if there's a majority that's... So it doesn't make a huge difference if the Democrats or Republicans are elected, but it does make a difference in taxation, in foreign policy. And what we know, it's been studied, is that independently of any majority or plurality in the European Parliament, that voter preference doesn't get translated into the policies of the European Union. So these two very primitive notions of democracy simply don't happen. It's not a conspiracy, it's a structural, it's part of the structural design. And the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Even though since 1979, the first year for direct elections to the European Parliament, when the European Parliament had very few powers compared to today, and 65% or more or less voted, and people were said, how come so few are voting? And the received knowledge was, well, because it has no powers, but if you give the European Parliament power, then people will start voting for it. So since 1979 until 2014, the European Parliament gained immense powers. It's a veritable co-legislature with the Council of Ministers, and yet in every single elections, including the last one, the number of people voting declined. And the people are not stupid. They don't vote for the European Parliament because in the two respects that I told you, it just doesn't matter. It doesn't translate into the kind of impact. For example, when we go to elections here in November, it will have an impact if we vote for Trump or if we vote for Clinton. And if you vote for the European Parliament, it doesn't have that kind of impact in that primitive way, who will govern us and in what way we will be governed. So this is what Europe should be taking as the lesson of Brexit, that there's something deeply flawed in the structure of governance of the European Union that somehow, regrettably, got translated into the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom, but it exists throughout the European Union, and that something ought to be done about it in a very radical way, and you see no discussion of that. All the discussion, if you see the speeches in the European Parliament, etc., let's have more integration on security because people will want it, let's have more a better coherent policy towards migration, but there's no discussion about this deep structural flaw in the way Europe is governed, and it's that structural flaw, in my view, that feeds the anger more than austerity or growth, etc. The second thing is, Europe is fixated in its relation to Brexit. They say if Britain wants access to the single market, they have to accept the four fundamental freedom, free movement of workers, knowing full well that Britain will not accept that, because if there was one thing, stupid in my view, that the Brits were against was free movement of workers. I can't resist a footnote. You know the definition of chutzpah. You kill your mother and your father and you say, mercy, I'm an orphan. When the new member states joined, there was a possibility of having a transitional period in accepting migrants from Poland, Romania, etc., etc. Germany took advantage of it, Spain took advantage of it, France took advantage of it. Britain said, no, welcome. You say welcome, 1 million migrants come to the benefit of the economy, in my view, and then you shout, mercy, I'm an orphan, they came. You invite them in and then you complain. That's the end of the footnote. But it's simply not the case that is made again and again that free movement of workers has to be the condition for access to the single market. the European Union negotiated an agreement with Canada, the CETA. It gives Canada extensive access to the single market, both in goods and in services. They have more than 100 free trade agreements with countries all over the world, which give extensive access to the single market without free movement of workers. With that beacon of democracy, Turkey, they have a customs union. And all the member states of the European Union have a myriad of bilateral investment treaties which provide that if somebody invests in that member state, namely in the European Union, the directors of the company have access to manage the investment. My point, to summarize this point, is if you took all the agreements that the European Union has with third countries which give access to the single market, and you offered that to Britain, and why should you not offer it to Britain? You offer it to Canada and you don't offer it to Britain. At least 80% of what Britain would want in terms of access of the single market would already be satisfied. Why not put that on the table? Why not say to Britain, the starting point is a kind of internal most favored nations. Whatever we offer the rest of the world, we will offer you. And then we will negotiate that 20%, the most delicate being the banking sector. That's what will be the negotiation. But for the rest, it's an open door. We don't have to negotiate with you what we've already negotiated with the Canadians. So why aren't they doing that? Because they're afraid that if Brexit is so attractive, then other member states of the European Union will say, me too. I also want an arrangement like that. And my answer to that is, great. The Union would be better off if some of those countries who are uncomfortable with the project, who are not going to accept more integration, who will not accept any movement towards a fiscal Europe, which is absolutely necessary if the euro is not to continue limping and moving from crisis to crisis, why not say to them, okay, there's a status which is associate membership, negotiated with the United Kingdom, and now it's your moment of truth. You prefer that? Welcome. There will be a Europe de vitesse, and the core that will stay will go ahead with the more integration, with mobilization, with a real support that the project of European integration requires. Why not put that on the table instead of, I'm not only talking about the Prime Minister of Slovakia, I'm talking about Mr. Draghi saying, no, four freedoms, free movement of workers is absolutely fundamental. You don't accept that, you can't have access to the single market. The Canadians, yes, and Britain, no. And my last point, it's limited access because Britain would still be at a great disadvantage. They will not be at the negotiating table. When new rules are designed, they will have to take it or leave it. When they're in, they get to decide with everybody. When they're out, you can have access to the single market, but it's according to the rules, and that's a huge cost which Britain will face. So I think the approach taken by the Union is misguided. It's both not looking at the real problem, which is the structural problem of governance, and playing this hardball with Britain, which simply doesn't make sense. Thank you.
Okay, so I now would offer the panelists a chance to respond to each other for a few minutes before we go into discussion with the audience. So obviously, Reverend King.
Well, I'd just like to say how much I agree with Joseph, and I think that if he was representing the EU and I the UK, this whole negotiation could be ready by dinner tonight. And I think the point that's made here, and this is the way I'd put my British reaction to the important points that Joseph made, there is a real sense in Britain that we're not leaving the European Union, they are leaving us. And the reason for that is that in 1999, the project of monetary union utterly transformed what the EU was. And when I gave my maiden speech to the House of Lords 18 months ago, I said almost exactly what Joseph said, which is that unless there are two clear categories of membership, one for those in the monetary union and the other for those outside it, then we were on a path that was bound to lead to dissension and conflict. And the kind of integration that is necessary to have a hope of the monetary union working is something utterly different from that which anyone in the United Kingdom could remotely accept. The idea of a common finance minister and a fiscal union it's not on anyone's agenda in the United Kingdom. The way I put it in my article in the New York Review of Books was to say, why would anybody join a tennis club if they couldn't play tennis, actually hated tennis, on the off chance they might get a game of bridge once a month? I mean, the whole project has moved away from its original intention to a construction which is perfectly valid for those who are members of it, but it's not appropriate for those who are outside the single currency. And I think it's very important to understand that people in Britain do distinguish between three distinct entities: Europe, the European Union, and the Monetary Union. No doubt, Rob, there are some people in Britain who are racist and xenophobic and protectionist. But the majority of people in Britain are neither racist, nor xenophobic, nor protectionist. And they didn't vote for Brexit because they were. They voted for Brexit because if you take Gillian's slogan of take back control, that's not a bad one. After all, there was a young man not so long ago who had a slogan called take control, who fought against the British troops to establish independence for the United States. And the fifth biggest economy of the world, the United Kingdom, it's not unreasonable. You may disagree, you may agree. But it's not an absurd position to argue that it ought to be a sovereign country setting its own laws. Now, what we desperately need now is a new partnership between the UK and the rest of the European Union. I think, actually, Joseph and I could have it sorted out by dinner. No doubt that won't happen, but nevertheless, I think the lines on which it should proceed are actually fairly clear.
Grania, would you want to briefly respond to some of the reactions?
Sure. Maybe just a couple of very brief points. Two things to Joseph. I don't think that the orphan metaphor captures what happened in the sense that the person or the entity that chose not to exercise the controls on free movement and then the people who rejected it were different. So the government didn't put it to the people. In other words, the British government chose free movement for economic reasons, and that seems to have been a very sensible choice. If you spoke to anyone in the National Health Service or elsewhere, can say that free movement of labour has been a very good thing for the British economy. But it's a matter of the popular sentiment, which isn't really, as Gillian said, to do with statistics or economic arguments. It's to do with a sense of feeling overwhelmed or something of that kind. We can call it racist, we can call it something else, but it's certainly to do with a popular sentiment about Britain having changed. I also think that links to the point about the generational difference, I think, is a very interesting one. I mean, I wonder, so I think what Gillian described again about parents and children rings very true, and I suspect that those who knew the UK before it joined the EU have a different sense of those who have only known the UK as a member of the EU. And take from that what you will, but those who have only known the UK as members of the EU are very positive about it. So I think that's another, and the younger people, students and so on, have a much more positive sense of what the advantages of being in Europe and being part of the European Union. I'm sorry to say in Europe. Mervyn always says, do not say in Europe when you mean in
We're still in Europe.
Yes, exactly. So I just corrected myself on that. And then the final point, maybe just to make in response to, so there's a sort of a catch-22 in Joseph's diagnosis of the problem, and you didn't really say much about the prognosis for reform, but you said the need for governance reform. But of course, if the problem is one of control and throw out how to elect those who are in control, the idea would be then that you should be able to elect a European government that's in control, whereas the idea at the moment is we've never gone towards a centralized European system. What we have is you elect your own government, and then they represent you in the European Council, and then we elect the European Parliament, but that's not really the controlling government. That's more like a so it's something unique, transnational we have. So I almost, in what you said, Joseph, seems to me to go against what you've argued for long, that Europe has its distinctive, what you called Sonderweg, which is a distinctive third way. It's not a national democracy, and it's not a European democratic government. It's something in between. And I think I think the picture you presented is almost one, and maybe that's what Mervyn's saying, is that we need a European Eurozone, small Europe Eurozone that's governed like a state, and where you can throw out the leadership or not and have elections, and then something wider. I think that's a very radical picture. Maybe, has very profound implications. I'm not sure if it's the same one that you have in mind.
Gillian, do you want to respond to anything?
Yeah, just a couple of quick comments. Firstly, people like me in my generation, who for the most part voted to remain, did so not because we think that Brussels is great. Having worked in Brussels as a reporter, I think that much of the European Union's bureaucracy is appalling and makes Washington look positively rational. But the issue at stake really was
Photo finish.
Well, they're both pretty ghastly. I mean, the Brussels bureaucracy is just appalling, and with a revolving parliament, it's even worse. And I would absolutely echo everything that Joseph said about the lack of democratic accountability and the fact that people had very good reasons to be not just so much frustrated, but disgusted, because I'm frustrated and disgusted. But the issue really is one about identity. And for people like myself, most of my friends who have built, if not an international life, but a life which is open. We grew up, watching Eurovision Song Contest, taking it for granted that we could travel anywhere in the European Union, taking for granted, we're not particularly fussed by borders and boundaries. And there are the same kind of difference in attitudes towards national identity as there is, I must say, towards, say, same-sex marriage. It's a generational issue. We don't have memories of the British Empire. In fact, we're all a bit embarrassed about having had an empire before, whereas the next generation up has a different view of that. For us, the idea of suddenly retreating into a little England is frankly absolutely appalling. Most of my friends who are international are doing everything they can to get Irish passports, green cards, anything else, to have a second option. Now, that may be an overreaction. As you say, it's 5 stages of the grief. It may turn out that actually the vision that Theresa May is going to lay out is going to be one of a fantastically dynamic, vibrant, inclusive, open economy. And people like Sadiq Khan, who I recently saw in New York, are doing absolutely everything they can to try and ensure that London remains like that. If so, that is fantastic, and we will stand up and cheer. But when I hear people like Amber Rudd today in Birmingham saying things like, she's going to keep a checklist of companies which aren't hiring enough UK-based employees, and we need to stop foreign workers overwhelming the UK and keep controls on foreign workers and employ British people instead, or else those companies are going to suffer. What I take away from that is a rising anti-business sentiment, which is seen, of course, in US politics too, and a rising sense that it's kind of okay to be a bit xenophobic.
So on that note, rather distressing note, although not so much about younger folks, the floor is open. We have about 10 to 12 minutes for questions. And I'm going to collect 2 or 3. If you could wait for the microphone.
So my first question is,
You'll only get one
Oh,
because
sorry.
we want to have several
is
people have a chance to ask questions.
what would be your vision for the immigrants that are already in England if you were to negotiate the treaty today before dinner for what would be the future of Europe? Like, what would you do with the million Polish, Romanian, and whatever else the combination includes who are already there?
Yes.
Thank you. Actually, maybe just a remark on the question of can the UK negotiate with the EU without the free movement of persons. I gave an interview a year ago to BBC. They wanted to know, is the Swiss option an option? And no, the Swiss option is not an option, because Switzerland has free movement of persons. They tried to terminate it 2 years ago in a referendum. And basically, the EU has the possibility to terminate all other treaties. And this is where they are negotiating in the moment. So it's not being mean against the UK. It's a general principle. If you have integrated single market types of treaties, and the Swiss treaties are bilateral. You can't have that without free movement of persons. So don't take it bad for the if the EU does the same here.
Yes, at the back.
Thank you. It's great that we have Gillian Tett in the panel, because I would like to ask, do you think that it was right for the Financial Times or the Economist or all the media generally to take a firm stance against Brexit? Because I think that this is also the case on the mainstream anti-Trump movement here in the US, and I think there is a parallel. And I think that this has exactly the counter effect to the anti-establishment feeling that the public is having.
Okay, so I'd ask the relevant panelists, and you know who you are, to respond. Yeah.
I'll jump in there because that was the last thing. Okay, I would love to think that it was the FT what lost it, and that the world was full of so many FT readers that they all decided that the FT's backing it, therefore we want to be anti-elitist. Sadly, I don't think our subscription is quite so high in the UK. But the important point is, yes, absolutely, the FT epitomized an elite viewpoint, not as a deliberate strategy, but because we don't control our columnists at all. We let them write whatever they want. As a result, we have generally a sort of chaotic cacophony of views. On this one, reflecting the problem about elitism, almost all the columnists, bar one, took a very strong view that Brexit was going to be completely mad. And so we looked very biased, not by design, but because essentially, that was the way that a particular group of internationally minded, elite, business-focused economists tend to look at the world, which was unfortunate. And it's forced us to do a lot of soul-searching. And certainly in the US, I am going out of my way, because I oversee the Financial Times in America, or the Americas, I'm going out of my way to make sure we don't fall into the same trap and really go out and behave like, dare I say, anthropologists. I was trained as an anthropologist, and talk to people on the ground and listen to why they're angry, what they're saying, and try to do as good a job as we possibly can about being fair. But, the problem is that the type of divide you saw in the media, and I'd say that other parts of the British media actually came out very strongly in favour of Brexit. We are essentially often a mirror. We both reflect and reinforce existing biases. Our job as journalists is to try and challenge them, and that's certainly what we're trying to do.
So the million or so non-UK but EU nationals who are in Britain now, what happens?
So I would give immediate guaranteed permanent residence to all existing EU people living in the UK. I'm sure that's what will happen, and the government has basically conceded that, but said it will not formally do anything until it receives a reciprocal right for those UK residents living in, say, France and Spain, of whom there are a very large number. I also think it's worth pointing out that Gillian talked about young people being internationally minded as if old people aren't. And if you go to any British airport, what you will find of the airport crammed with older British people desperate to fly to Europe, to go on holiday, to enjoy the cultural advantages. There has never been a greater link between British citizens and going to other parts of Europe in our entire history. More people live abroad, they study abroad, they intermarry. This is not a question about attitudes towards Europe. It was very clearly a question about the European Union. And that links, I think, to the problem that I had with the media campaign on both sides. Both sides thought the answer was blindingly obvious. In Gillian's own words, you'd have to be mad to be on the other side. Actually, there were quite good arguments on both sides, and it deserved a serious and reasoned debate. And in my view, the reason the government lost this referendum, and they would have won it, in my view, if they'd adopted different tactics, the reason they lost it was because they engaged in a propaganda war which became literally incredible to the average British citizen, who were told that all economists could tell you exactly that you'd be £4,310 worse off, that if we voted for Brexit, there'd be an immediate recession, and the result of that would be an austerity budget to raise taxes and cut spending. All of this, frankly, was rather lunatic arguments put forward. And if somebody had been prepared to say there are arguments on the other side, I accept that, but on balance, I would like to persuade you that my position is the right one. Nobody on either side of the campaign did that, and I think that led to a tremendous disillusion among voters that they were being treated as children, not as adults, and the people who lost from that was the government that were responsible for putting forward the arguments for Remain.
So earlier, I can't resist mentioning, earlier this fall, I was in fact at an EU airport trying to rush through passport control, and there were lots of older British people right in front of me, and it was very frustrating because they were in the non-EU passport line. So I had to tell them, you know, get over to that other much shorter line. This may be your last chance to do it.
Can I just also say the reason why there are lots of old people going on holiday elsewhere is partly because they have the money in the UK. Young people don't.
So finally, the question of whether it requires some kind of fundamental treaty revision to make freedom of movement negotiable, which I gather is your point.
I want to say something.
Yeah.
I deliberately didn't use Switzerland and Norway as the model, where they negotiated full integration into the single market, which would, of course, include free movement of workers. But what I said was that if we look at the array of agreements which the EU has with the rest of the world, which is very extensive access to the single market, although non-complete, but does not include, by design, free movement of workers, it would probably satisfy 80% of what Britain needs, and then there will be negotiations on a sectoral basis. Can I say a word on the young people? It's true that of those young people who voted, a majority voted against Brexit, but it is also true that most young people voted by not voting. There was the majority of young people simply didn't bother to go and vote. Can I have one last point? The fundamental difference, if you look at la classe politique in France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and in Britain, I think it's true, although it sounds highfalutin. They treat the union as a community of fate. We're in it together. We have problems, we have to solve it together. They are not continuously making a calculation of a cost-benefit. Do I get something more or do I get something less? The British attitude has always been, and I don't criticize it, it's been a trade-off. Is it a good trade-off or a bad trade-off for Britain? And that's a fundamental attitudinal difference between the United Kingdom and the core members of the European Union. When there's a crisis in Italy, nobody says, okay, let's give up Italy. Let's just solve the crisis. When there's a crisis in Europe, the Germans, the Spaniards, the French, the Italians, they say there's a crisis, we'll argue about it, austerity or not, but we have to do this together. The British take a different view. Cost benefit, are we better off in, are we better off out? And they decided they're better off out, I think mistakenly. But it really is an attitudinal difference. And that's why maybe in that deep sense, given where the European Union is and where it wants to go, it was in that deep sense maybe a predictable outcome.
So General de Gaulle was right all along. So on that note, I would like to thank our panelists. And I would also like to thank my colleagues Michael Ori and Christina Napolitano, who were indispensable for organizing this event.